Hello, everyone. My name is Megan Salas, and I am the Objects Conservator on an IMLS grant-funded project here at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. First, I would like to respectfully acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the traditional homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and people. I also acknowledge that the state of Colorado includes the traditional and ancestral lands of 48 Native American tribal nations who now live in the American Southwest, Great Plains, and Rocky Mountain region. So hello, everyone. I'm really glad you could join me today. I am a cultural heritage conservator, which means that I am concerned with the long-term preservation of material culture, and that can mean everything from fine art objects, cultural materials, archaeological artifacts, and natural history specimens. So in addition to repairing and stabilizing items via conservation treatment, conservators like me are also involved in activities like documentation, examination, outreach, research, and preventive care. In 2020, DMNS was awarded IMLS, which stands for Institute of Museum and Library Services, grant funding for a 2-year project entitled the Northwest Coast Collection, Building Bridges in Detailed Condition Survey. So this grant is focused on approximately 700 items from the Northwest Coast Collection, which is part of the anthropology collection here at DMNS. And these around 700 items come from the communities that are highlighted at the large map on the right, which include Haida, Kwakwaka'wakw, Makah, Nuchalnuk, and Tlingit. And so this grant, the aim of the grant is that these items will come into the conservation lab where we can study their materials, their techniques, and their condition. And any evidence of deterioration will be documented and steps for future conservation treatment and preservation will be proposed. A big part of this grant is collaboration with the source communities from which these items originally came. And this type of collaboration is a really key way to gaining a better understanding of the items, promoting access to them, and really establishing what the best methods are for culturally responsible care for these items. And so far, the collaboration has involved communication with the source communities, sharing detailed lists and images of the collection items, and answering questions that they might have. A part of the project that we are really looking forward to is for tribal members to come from these communities to DMNS to view the collection material and participate in shared examination and decision-making about the next steps in terms of preservation for these materials. So this grant includes a bunch of different types of materials from both a cultural and a material standpoint. And so it includes masks, garments, baskets, tools, fishing hooks, all sorts of things. But today I want to talk about and share with you some items that I have really fallen in love with lately, and that is spoons and ladles from these communities. And so these materials are usually made out of wood or horn, and carved spoons from the Northwest Coast have been and are used by these cultures for eating as well as serving in everyday context, as well as ceremonial use. So in ceremonies and feastings, in celebrations known as potlatches. And oftentimes these spoons are intricately carved with really beautiful representations of animals, humans, ancestors, supernatural beings. And these are just a few examples of things that are in the collection. And before I show you some of the materials that are currently in the lab, I just wanted to introduce a little bit about animal horn, which is a common material that these spoons and ladles are made out of. So animal horn is primarily composed of the protein keratin, and it grows on the animal around a bony core. It's the same, keratin is the same material that we find in our hair and our fingernails. And an important thing to remember about animal horn is that it has a direction, or these longitudinal ridges, which you probably are familiar with in terms of these kind of vertical striations on your fingernail. So keep that in mind when we look at some of these materials in the lab. And in terms of traditional ways of processing animal horn, it is a thermoplastic material, which means that it becomes flexible and soft when it's heated. So after harvesting the horn from the animal and cleaning it a little bit, it would have been soaked and boiled, which makes it much more flexible and easy to work. And at that point, as you can see in some of these images, wood molds are used to open the horn and to reshape it. And once it has dried and cooled down in this form, it retains this form, which is really interesting, I think. So next, we are going to take a look at some of the items that are currently in the lab, and I'm going to point out some interesting observations that I've made in terms of their materials and the techniques, as well as condition issues. So bear with me for 1 second while I transition to my phone camera so we can look at the materials in the lab. Okay. Oh. Okay, I think we should be ready to go now. So the first materials that we're going to look at are actually these two. Oh, sorry, and I forgot. This is Catherine Roysch, conservation technician here at DMNS, and she's going to give me a hand with handling these materials since I am operating the camera. So the first two objects that, wait 1 second. Okay, the first two objects that we're going to take a look at are these two ladles that are both made of mountain sheep horn. They date to the 19th century, and they are from the Kwakwaka'wakw culture, which are the traditional inhabitants of present-day Vancouver Island, British Columbia. So what's interesting, I think, about these two items is that you can really, here, let me turn this light on. Hopefully we can get a really good sense of just the material nature of animal horn. So you can see that it's definitely more opaque here at the handle where it's thicker. And then if we look in the bowl where the animal horn is thinner, you can see that it's quite translucent, which is quite remarkable. Same thing on this one here. And if we look carefully, you can hopefully get a sense of these ridges that I was talking about in terms of the way that the keratin structure is arranged. So both of these items are in quite good condition. There aren't too many signs of deterioration. And the next item that I want to look at is this ladle, which is quite a bit larger, as you can see. And it has some nice carvings here, some circular designs. So this is a good example of a mountain sheep horn that would have really been, it had to be straightened out. So this would have, been done how I was describing in terms of making it soft and flexible. One interesting thing about this piece is that you can see these light marks in the bowl here. And I will point them out, these areas. And this is potentially residue. Sorry, my camera is a little bit activating. Okay, so these are potential, this material is actually sitting on top of the surface of the horn. And we confirm this by looking at it carefully under the microscope. So this is interesting because this could potentially be residue from use. So when this item was used by, this is also kwakwaka'wakw. So when it was used in its original cultural context, potentially to serve something. So this is a good example of something that we could ask the tribe, you know, what, do they have any idea of what this material could be, these drips that are still visible, excuse me, on the bowl here. Another interesting thing about this object is that you can see there are some condition concerns. There's some cracking that's happening. If you can see right here, up here. And this is related to the structure of the keratin, the fibrous structure of the keratin and its longitudinal direction. So this is actually what we conservators will call delamination, which essentially is separation. And these are, you know, kind of natural weak points in the material, but this is likely a manifestation of fluctuations in environmental conditions like temperature and relative humidity. So when this type of material experiences fluctuations in relative humidity, it will absorb moisture and swell, as well as desorb moisture and shrink. And this kind of dimensional change can result in physical stress, which can result in things like this. So this is why it's important in museum environments. We always try and keep environmental conditions very stable so that we can avoid this kind of these kinds of stresses and what they can result in. I also want to point out on this item that there's evidence of pest damage. And hopefully you can see these little holes right here. And you can see these holes have very clean edges. And this is very characteristic of pest damage. And the pests that we would suspect for this type of material would be carpet beetles or moth larvae, perhaps. They like to feed on proteinaceous materials. So this is an illustration of you know, something that you might be familiar with in museums, where we try to limit the amount of food and drink that are in spaces, especially collection spaces. And we like to really monitor items as well as like lab spaces. Unfortunately, there's no evidence that this is an active infestation. This likely occurred a long time ago. I don't see any kind of specimens of these insects, or I don't see any frass or waste material. So that's good, but it is important to note that this is part of this item's history. The next item I want to show you is this spoon, which comes from the Haida culture. And as you can probably immediately tell, it is made out of two horns, not just one. And so the lighter colored horn here is probably mountain sheep horn. And the darker colored horn here at the handle is likely mountain goat horn. And it is riveted, these two pieces are riveted together with metal rivets. And this also has some carvings on the handle, which are quite nice, as well as some abalone shell inlay. And so this item has some of the same condition problems that I mentioned with the last ladle, which is, you know, delamination between these in the longitudinal direction of the horn. And then there's also some pest damage on the reverse side of the horn. But one thing that I think is interesting about this item is that I observed that the handle here is kind of shiny, and it looks like there might be some material applied to the surface to maybe kind of change its visual appearance. And one thing that conservators sometimes do is use alternate light sources to look at the materials that we're studying. And, you know, sometimes with the naked eye, I could just tell that maybe it's a little bit shiny, maybe something was applied. But if you look at it under something like UV radiation, you can sometimes materials behave differently under different types of radiation, and you can make some conclusions based on those observations. So Catherine is going to turn the lights off, and we're going to take a look and see. I have a UV flashlight here. We're going to see if we can show you what I've observed, which is this. Hopefully you can see this handle. There's definitely a kind of yellow-green fluorescence that is happening on the handle. And this is very characteristic of materials such as natural resin varnishes, so something like Damar. And this was likely applied to the handle just to kind of, you know, change its visual properties, to make it shiny. This is something that we often see in oil paintings that are varnished. So that was an interesting conclusion. And this is another example of a question that we might have for the tribal members, like, is this a traditional practice to apply a varnish to, you know, the handle, to certain parts of these spoons? Okay. And now we're going to look at one more item, which is this spoon. It is also from the Haida culture. And as you can maybe tell, is Catherine? Yeah. So it's a little, maybe you can tell that it's not quite as transparent in the bowl as some of the ones that we looked at previously. This is actually made out of wood. It's not horn. And if you were able to handle it, you might also, that's another clue. It's much lighter. It doesn't feel as dense as the horn spoons. And there is also some wood morphology. You can see some tree rings that are present. So this is definitely wood, not horn. It also has some nice carvings on the handle. And what's interesting about this item is that it actually has been previously repaired. Here, I'm sorry, I'm trying to. So here is one of the joins. It goes this way, and there's another join that goes this way. So this has been glued together, and we don't have records of this intervention. So this likely was done, or most definitely was done before this object entered the museum collection. Whenever conservators see previous kind of repairs, we always try and assess how stable they are. These are very stable. There's no mobility or wiggling associated with them, so that's good. There is a little bit of this material that was used as the adhesive. You can probably see it's a little bit dark. It's dark brown. This is a sign that it's likely an adhesive that has fallen out of use in terms of what we would use today in conservation to repair something like this. And this is an illustration of, you know, one of the important things that we as conservators do is perform really thorough documentation. So anytime that we treat an object, if we were to repair something like this, we would create really detailed records that explained what we did, why we did it, what materials we used. And this would be, you know, for the purpose of the future, so people could look back and have a record and know what materials we used. And sometimes materials, they're accepted and used quite widely, and then, you know, perhaps more scientific analysis is done on these adhesives, and it's found out that these actually aren't so great. They're not so stable to use. So sometimes that can, so having a record of what was used can be a really important guide in terms of potential deterioration that we might observe. But these joins look stable now, and so we probably wouldn't take them down, but that is something that we would maybe consider about bringing up to the tribes. And there's also a label in the bowl of this spoon, which is interesting. It's pretty dirty and you can't maybe see it too well, but there's a label, and this is something that was likely put in place by an art dealer, a collector. This was done definitely before the object entered the museum collection. And this is something perhaps that we would consider removing, just because it is kind of obscuring the surface of the item. It's definitely not original to when this item was created by the Haida culture. So this is something that we would consider removing, but of course saving. We wouldn't just throw it away. We would want to keep it because it does have some writing on it, but it is a little bit distracting. So I think those are all the items we are going to look at for now. But I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about these items or spoons in general. So let me take a minute to switch cameras or switch my audio again, and then I'll be happy to take any questions.
Perfect. I'll jump in right here, Megan. Hi, everybody. My name is Memory Williams. I work in the marketing department here at the museum, and I'm just jumping in like I always do to relay your questions to our presenters. So if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, just drop those questions in the comments and we'll get Megan to answer those. I don't see any thus far, but I have a few that I want to ask as we wait for more questions to come in once Megan gets set back up.
I think I'm ready.
Perfect. Awesome. So I just wonder, what led you to studying this? I mean, such a almost like a niche, sheep horns and spoons and ladles. What led you to that?
Well, there are a lot of them that are part of this grant. And when I was initially looking through the lists and images of the items that are part of the 700 that I mentioned, I noticed that there were a lot. And I always think that it's interesting to kind of delve a little bit deeper into something when you have like a set that you can compare and really observe differences between them. So there's other ones that are in the lab that I didn't show you today, but I think it's really interesting when you have, 4 different ladles that initially might look very similar, but once you start looking more closely, you can notice differences in condition as well as techniques and the carvings as well.
Wow, that's a good point. Yeah, even when you were going through them and pointing out those different differences and subtleties, I'm like, oh, wow, when I first looked at it, I didn't notice that. But of course, your professional eye notices. Oh, yes. Okay. I see we have some questions coming in on Facebook. We have one from Chris who asks, were these items acquired by the Cranes?
I believe all of the ones that I showed you, yes, were part of the Crane collection. So that's a large part of the anthropology collection. The Native American materials that are here at the museum came as part of the Cranes, who were a couple of collectors that collected things in the mid 20th century. So yes, I believe all of these are part of the Crane collection.
Awesome. Sally asked, have any of these items been dated?
Yes, so sometimes our records do have dates, sometimes they don't though. And it has to do a lot with the kind of the collecting history and how much information was initially gathered about the materials at the point when they were removed from their original culture groups. The 2 that I showed you, let me see if I can, the 2 that I showed you first, I'll do it on this way. These 2 date to the mid 19th century, so 1800s. So they are quite old, and it's interesting because they're probably in the best condition out of the ones that I showed you. And unfortunately, we don't have dates for this one and the other 2. But I would say that in general, these types of items could date to the 1800s, the earliest. And then there's certainly, like, this is a technique that people still practice today. Probably not as widespread as it once was, but people still make items like this. So, this is a tradition that, we could find items from later that also, have similar materials and techniques.
Interesting. So most seem to be from the 1800s. Okay, we have another question from Dominique, who asks, what's the hardest kind of repair to do?
The hardest? Well, that's a hard question to answer, but I will say that often when you are dealing with items that have been previously repaired, that can be really challenging because it's not just that you have a fresh break that you need to fix, you're actually also contending with old adhesives, old materials that need to be removed completely. And you need to try and gather as much information as you can about those old materials and techniques that were used by either previous conservators or likely non-conservators. And so I would say that that always makes things a little bit more complicated when you're having to take down some work that someone else has done and then figure out the best way to do it with the knowledge that we have today.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, we may let these questions from Ellen be our last ones. It depends on how many more we get. But okay. Ellen asked, did these peoples also create utensils for their daily use, similar to our spoons, forks, and knives? If so, are there any in the objects you are observing? And also, where will these objects go once you have completed your survey? Two great questions.
Yeah, those are good questions. So yeah, most of these items that I showed you today are large and they would have either been serving utensils, so not for one person to eat out of, but to serve something out of a larger container. We do have smaller ones and ones that are less decorative. So those, we have a couple wooden ones. And so those most definitely were used in a more everyday setting. So, and they don't have really intricate carvings or anything. So yes, we do have some examples of kind of more everyday utensil type items. And these items, we do have, if anyone is local and curious, there are examples of these horns, spoons, and ladles up in Crane Hall on view. But these items came from storage into the lab. We have a really nice storage facility. So after I'm done looking at them and tribal members can come view them, they have a really nice, safe, stable home in storage. And it is accessible also to researchers and people who have an interest in these materials. So it's not that they're locked away for no one to look at again, but they do have, they have very nice mounts that they sit in storage.
Yes, awesome. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions, but how about we let this one that I'm about to ask be our last. Okay. You talk a lot about the relationship between you and the tribal communities and how much of a part they are in this process with you. Can you talk some and speak some to forming those relationships and maintaining those relationships and how all that goes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've been here for, I guess, 4.5 months. So it's still kind of, I'm still at the phase where I'm building those relationships, and COVID really did throw a wrench in a lot of arranging plans to have them visit. But they have all the 5 communities that I've reached out to have been very eager to participate in this project and have been curious about the collection items that I've sent them images of. And actually my point of contact that is Kwak actually did some outreach and got some, I didn't include it today, but it was in a recent Instagram post, some information from the community about the techniques and the language that they use to describe these items. So that was really great. And I hope to do more kind of, until we can get them here in the lab, some more just virtual communication in terms of gathering information and sharing whatever they might want from us in terms of the collections that we have here.
Yeah, Awesome, great. Yeah, and like Megan said, we're going to continue to cover her research and her work on social media. Like she said, we did do one post about this, which we can post in the chat for you to look at. But really interesting work, really great work. So thank you so much, Megan, for coming on Science Division Live today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you everyone who tuned in.
Yes, and we'll be right back here next Thursday at 12 o'clock for another episode. We'll see you then. Have a great week.
Bye. Thank you.